The fluorescent lights of LAX airport cast harsh shadows across the elderly man's weathered face as TSA agents surrounded his worn military duffel bag. His gnarled hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the toll of decades spent serving, a country that now treated him like a threat, his tired eyes holding secrets darker than the shadows stretching across the terminal floor. When the security officers forcefully unzipped his bag, the metal object that tumbled out caused gasps to ripple through the crowded checkpoint, but it wasn't what anyone expected. What could make hardened TSA agents step back in shock, then stand at attention with tears in their eyes? Subscribe to our channel to discover more untold stories of America's forgotten heroes and help us ensure that no veteran sacrifice fades into silence. Type honor in the comments if you believe. Every hero deserves to be remembered. The day had started like any other for James Harrison. At 4:30 a.m., his internal clock, trained by decades of military service, woke him without need for an alarm. He sat on the edge of his bed, running weathered fingers through thinning gray, hair joints creaking as he stood to face another day. The small apartment he called home was quiet, save for the distant hum of early morning traffic on the Los Angeles freeway. His worn military duffel bag sat ready by the door, packed the night before with the same precision he'd learned in basic training 50 years ago. Inside lay everything he needed for the trip to Washington, D.C., including the one item he'd sworn never to travel without, no matter the complications it might cause. The Uber driver who picked him up barely acknowledged his presence, too engrossed in his phone during red lights to notice the military bearing of his passenger or the way Harrison's eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, old habits that never died. The drive to LAX passed in silence, broken only by the occasional GPS instruction. Early morning travelers streamed through the airport's entrance, their faces illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lighting. Business people in pressed suits rushed past, pulling sleek carry-ons. Families herded children and luggage through the sliding doors. None spared a glance for the elderly man in the worn leather jacket, making his way slowly but purposefully toward the security checkpoint. The line at TSA was already long, snaking back and forth between the retractable barriers. Harrison took his place, standing at parade rest out of ingrained habit. A young mother struggling with a stroller caught his eye, and he offered her his spot with a gentle smile. She hurried past with barely a thank you, but Harrison didn't mind. Kindness wasn't about recognition. As the line inched forward, the noise level rose with the growing crowd. A group of college students ahead of him laughed loudly about their spring break plans. Behind him, a businessman barked orders into his phone. Harrison remained still, an island of calm in the chaos, though his right hand occasionally drifted to the duffel bag at his side, checking its presence. What no one in that line could see were the memories playing behind his eyes. Memories of another time, another place, where the weight of responsibility had first settled onto his young shoulders. But those thoughts would have to wait. The TSA agent was waving him forward, and Harrison could already see the look in the young man's eyes, that mix of boredom and authority that too often masked understanding. ID and boarding pass, the agent demanded without looking up. Harrison carefully produced both documents, handling his military ID with particular reverence. The agent glanced at them briefly, made a marking, and pointed toward the security. Scanners, remove all metal objects, shoes and electronics, bags on the belt. What happened in the next few minutes would change everything, not just for Harrison, but for everyone watching. But for now, he simply nodded, stepped forward, and began to unzip his bag. The TSA checkpoint buzzed with the controlled chaos of early morning flights. Shoes clattered into plastic bins, laptops emerged from bags, and the conveyor belt hummed steadily as it fed belongings through the X-ray machine. Harrison stepped forward, his movements deliberate and measured, as he began the familiar ritual of security screening. A young TSA agent, maybe 25, with a fresh haircut and crisp uniform, watched Harrison with growing impatience. "Sir, you need to speed this up. There's a line." The words came sharp and fast, cutting through the ambient noise. Harrison didn't rush. He couldn't, not with what he carried. He carefully placed his shoes in a bin, followed by his leather jacket. The duffel bag he handled with particular care, laying it flat on the conveyor belt. The young agent's eye twitched with annoyance. "Is there a problem, sir?" The question carried an edge of authority that made several nearby passengers turn to watch. Harrison straightened up, his full height still impressive despite his years. "No problem," he replied quietly. "Just being careful with my belongings." The agent stepped closer, hand resting on his belt. "Any liquids, electronics, or metal objects in the bag?" Harrison met his gaze steadily. "Yes, there's a metal object. It's— Why didn't you declare that earlier?" The agent's voice rose, drawing more attention. "Step aside, sir. This bag needs additional screening." A second TSA agent approached, this one older, with gray at his temples. He positioned himself beside the first, hand extended toward the bag that was now emerging from the X-ray machine. The screen had shown something that caught their attention, something that made them exchange quick, meaningful glances. "Sir, can you explain what's in this bag?" the older agent asked, his tone professional but firm. Harrison nodded slowly. "If you'll allow me to explain—" "We'll need to open this bag," the younger agent interrupted, already reaching for the zipper. "Please step back." The crowd around them had grown still, conversations dying as people sensed the mounting tension. A child pointed, quickly shushed by his mother. Business travelers paused their phone calls, attention drawn to the unfolding scene. Harrison stood straight, dignity intact, despite the public scrutiny. His mind drifted momentarily to that morning, to the careful way he'd packed the bag, ensuring everything was secure. He'd known this might happen. It always did, but this time felt different. The young agent's aggressive stance, the growing crowd, the whispers spreading through the checkpoint, like wildfire. "Dangerous item in a bag at Terminal 4, the younger agent spoke into his radio, words clipped and official, requesting supervisor presence. Harrison's weathered hands remained at his sides, but his right index finger tapped against his leg, a subtle tell from years ago when he'd faced much worse situations than this. The morning light streaming through the terminal's windows caught the scars on his knuckles, testament to battles fought long ago. More TSA agents appeared, forming a loose perimeter around Harrison and his bag. The crowd pressed closer, phones raised to record whatever was about to happen. No one knew then that they were about to witness something that would spread across social media within hours, touching millions of hearts and changing policies forever. The supervisor arrived, a woman with steady eyes and a measured step. She took in the scene, noted Harrison's calm demeanor, and nodded to her team. "Open it," she ordered. The young agent reached for the zipper, and the next few seconds would change everything. The zipper's metallic rasp cut through the tense silence. Harrison watched, his expression unchanged, as the young TSA agent pulled the bag open with quick, aggressive movements. The overhead lights caught something inside, a flash of metal. That made the agent step back instinctively. "Sir, do not move," he commanded, voice sharp with authority, but Harrison hadn't moved. He stood perfectly still, the same way he'd stood in rice paddies and jungles half a century ago, when stillness meant survival. The object tumbled out onto the security table, and the gasps were audible. There, gleaming under fluorescent lights, lay a Medal of Honor, its blue ribbon slightly faded, but the 5-pointed star and band of 13 white stars unmistakable. The medal's presence commanded attention, silencing the checkpoint as effectively as a prayer. The younger agent's hand, which had been reaching for his radio, froze mid-motion. The older TSA officer took an involuntary step backward, his face draining of color as recognition dawned. Around them, phones lowered slowly, respect replacing curiosity. "Sir," the supervisor began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is this—" "Congressional Medal of Honor," Harrison confirmed quietly. "Awarded June 17, 1968. I never travel without it. The revelation rippled through the crowd. A businessman who'd been complaining loudly about delays minutes earlier removed his hat. A teenage girl who'd been filming stopped her recording, tears welling in her eyes. The weight of history had suddenly descended upon Terminal 4's security. Checkpoint, but it wasn't just the metal. As the bag lay open, other items became visible: a carefully folded American flag, worn photographs protected in plastic sleeves, and military orders yellowed with age. Each item told part of a story that had begun in the jungles of Vietnam and led to this moment. The young TSA agent's hands trembled slightly as he stepped back from the table. His earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by something that looked like shame. The older agent moved forward, his movements deliberate and respectful. "Sir," he said, addressing Harrison with newfound reverence, "I served 8 years in the Marines. May I ask where—" Before Harrison could answer, a new voice cut through the silence. "Dong Ap Bia Mountain, May 1969. The voice belonged to a man in a pilot's uniform who had stepped out of the crowd. That's where it happened, isn't it, Sergeant Harrison? Harrison's eyes met the pilot's, recognition flickering across his features. The pilot continued, his voice carrying across the now silent checkpoint. "My father served in the 101st Airborne. He told me about the man who went back 3 times into enemy fire to save his platoon, the man they called the Ghost of Hamburger Hill." The supervisor's eyes widened. She'd learned about Hamburger Hill in training, one of the bloodiest battles of the Vietnam War. But the classified details of what happened that day, the full extent of Harrison's actions, were only known to a select few. More phones emerged from the crowd, but not to record. People were searching, pulling up articles, connecting pieces of a puzzle they hadn't known existed moments ago. The name James Harrison began spreading in whispers, followed by fragments of an incredible story. "Sir," the supervisor said, her voice thick with emotion, "please allow us to escort you to our private screening area, and—" She paused, glancing at the medal with reverence. "If you're willing, we'd be honored to hear your story." Harrison nodded slowly, but his eyes were distant, seeing beyond the terminal walls, to a time when the metal around his neck had been shiny and new, and the price paid for it was still fresh in his memory. What happened next would change not just this airport, but how America treated its quiet heroes. But first, there was a story to tell. A story that began with a young sergeant on a blood-soaked mountain, making a choice that would echo across generations. The crowd parted as Harrison was led away, and not a single person complained about the delay. They knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, a moment when the past reached out to touch the present, reminding everyone that heroes still walked among them. What they didn't know was that this was just the beginning. Within hours, phones would start ringing in the Pentagon. Within days, news crews would descend on LAX. And within weeks, the story of what happened that morning would reach the halls of Congress. But for now, in that quiet moment, an old soldier followed the TSA supervisor, carrying with him memories of a war that had never really ended, and medals that carried the weight of history itself. The private screening room felt smaller than it was, crowded with the weight of history more than people. Harrison sat in an offered chair, his duffel bag now carefully placed on the table before him. The Medal of Honor caught the light, demanding attention even in stillness. The supervisor, whose name tag read Martinez, had cleared the room of all but essential personnel. The young TSA agent, who'd first confronted Harrison, stood in the corner, his earlier bravado replaced by a mixture of shame and awe. The pilot, who'd recognized Harrison's name, had been invited to stay, along with the older TSA officer who'd served in the Marines. "May I?" Martinez gestured to the medal. Harrison nodded, and she lifted it with reverence, handling it as if it were made of glass rather than metal. "I've never seen one in person before." "Not many have," Harrison replied softly. "There aren't many of us left." The pilot stepped forward, Captain Michael Roberts, sir. My father was David Roberts, Charlie Company. Harrison's eyes flickered with recognition. Dave Roberts. He carried a picture of his wife and newborn son. That would have been you. Roberts nodded, emotion catching in his throat. He told me the story so many times, about the ghost who appeared out of the smoke carrying wounded men to safety, how you went back again and again. The young TSA agent shifted uncomfortably in his corner, the magnitude of his earlier behavior settling heavily on his shoulders. Harrison noticed and offered him a gentle smile. Come closer, son. This story belongs to all of us. With trembling hands, Harrison reached into his bag and pulled out a weathered photograph. The image showed a group of young soldiers, their faces streaked with mud and exhaustion. This was taken 2 days before Hamburger Hill. Half these men never came down that mountain. The room fell silent as Harrison's mind drifted back to that day. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of memories that had never fully faded. It was raining, had been for days. The mountain was more mud than earth, and the NVA had every approach covered. We'd been taking heavy casualties, but orders were to take that hill, no matter the cost. His fingers traced the faces in the photograph. Tommy Chen, 18 years old, from San Francisco. Jimmy Marcus, 20, Alabama. Pete Davidson, 19, Kansas. Each name carried a story, a life cut short on that blood-soaked mountain. We'd made it halfway up when the first barrage hit. The air turned to fire. Men were falling everywhere. I heard Tommy screaming for a medic, but our medic had taken a round through the chest 10 minutes earlier. Harrison's right hand tapped against his leg, an unconscious rhythm matching the distant echo of gunfire in his memory. I don't remember deciding to go back. I just remember thinking that those were my boys up there, someone's sons, someone's brothers. The older TSA officer nodded in understanding. Marines never left their own behind. The first trip back, I found Tommy and Jimmy, carried them both somehow. The second time, I got Pete and 2 others. The third, Harrison paused, his eyes distant. The third time, I heard Dave Roberts calling for help. Captain Roberts leaned forward, hearing for the first time the details of how his father had survived that day. Your father had taken shrapnel to both legs. He was trapped in the open under heavy fire. I reached him just as he was pulling out your picture, the one of you and your mother. He thought he was going to die there. Harrison's voice grew quieter, but no less intense. I told him his son needed him to come home. Then I carried him down that mountain through the worst fire I'd ever seen. They told me later I'd been hit 3 times. I don't remember that part. The room was absolutely still now. Every person present understanding they were hearing a piece of history that didn't appear in any textbooks. The young TSA agent's eyes were wet with tears he couldn't hide. They gave me the medal 6 months later. President Johnson put it around my neck. Said I was a hero. Harrison shook his head slightly. But the real heroes were the ones who didn't come down that mountain. I wear this for them. Carry it with me always. So their sacrifice isn't forgotten. Martinez wiped her eyes discreetly. Sir, we had no idea. If there's anything we can do... Before she could finish, there was a knock at the door. Another TSA officer entered, his face urgent. Ma'am, there's a call from Washington. Pentagon officials are asking about a Medal of Honor recipient in our terminal. Harrison smiled quietly. And so it begins, he murmured, more to himself than the others. The story of Hamburger Hill was about to be told again, but this time it would change more than just the lives of those who heard it firsthand. The memories came in waves now, as unstoppable as the tide. As Harrison sat in the private screening room, waiting for whatever would come next, his mind drifted back to that first morning in Vietnam. The air had been thick with humidity, carrying the sweet rot smell of the jungle and something else. Something that every soldier eventually learned to recognize as fear. We were all so young, Harrison said softly, more to himself than his audience. Most of us had never been outside our own states, let alone halfway around the world. The room remained silent, respectfully waiting as history unfolded through his words. The young TSA agent had pulled up a chair, his earlier hostility completely forgotten. Captain Roberts stood at parade rest, unconsciously mimicking the military, bearing that had been drilled into his father. Our first firefight came 3 days after we landed. Charlie Company was pushing through the Ashau Valley. Intelligence said it was just a routine patrol. Harrison's laugh held no humor. Intelligence was wrong. His weathered hands reached into the duffel bag again, pulling out a carefully preserved map, its creases telling of countless foldings and unfoldings. The yellowed paper showed the valley, in careful detail, with handwritten notes in the margins. We lost 2 men that day, good men. Billy Thompson from Georgia, who carried a harmonica and played it every night, despite orders for silence. And Marcus Wade, who had a girl back home named Mary. He was going to propose when he got back. Harrison's finger traced a line on the map. Right here. They never made it past this bend in the river. The supervisor, Martinez, leaned forward. But that wasn't the day. I mean, Hamburger Hill was later, right? Harrison nodded. 3 months later. By then, we'd learned what war really was, lost the shine off our boots and the innocence in our eyes. But nothing prepared us for that mountain. He pulled out another photograph, this one showing a steep, mist-shrouded peak, Dong Ap Bia. That's what the locals called it. To us, it was Hill 937. Didn't become Hamburger Hill until after they saw what that mountain did to us. The older TSA officer, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. I've read about the battle, sir. 10 days of direct assault. 10 days of hell, Harrison corrected gently. The NVA had turned that mountain into a fortress. Bunkers, trenches, interlocking fields of fire. Every step up was paid for in blood. The room seemed to grow smaller as Harrison continued, his voice taking on a distant quality. The rain never stopped. The mud was so deep it would suck the boots right off your feet. And the noise. He paused, his right hand tapping that unconscious rhythm again. The noise never stopped either. Artillery, gunfire, men screaming, helicopters when they could fly. After a while, it all blended together into this terrible symphony. Captain Roberts pulled out his phone, pulling up an image. My father kept this picture his whole life. Said it was taken the morning before the final assault. He showed the sea. Screen to Harrison, who nodded in recognition. 3rd Platoon's final briefing. Your father's standing right there next to Lieutenant Wells. Wells didn't make it either. Harrison's voice caught slightly. Dave, your father, he was one of the best squad leaders we had, kept his men together when everything was falling apart. The young TSA agent, who had been silent for so long, finally found his voice. Sir, what? What was going through your mind when you went back up there into the fire? Harrison was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. You know, people have asked me that for 50 years. Reporters, military historians, politicians, they all want to know about the courage, the heroism. He shook his head slowly. But there wasn't time for any of that. There was just duty. Those were my men up there, my responsibility. He pulled out one final photograph from his bag. This one showed a much younger James Harrison standing at attention as President Johnson draped the Medal of Honor around his neck. They called it above and beyond the call of duty, but every man on that mountain would have done the same. I was just the one who made it back. The room fell silent. Again, each person processing the weight of what they were hearing. Outside, they could hear the regular bustle of the airport continuing, passengers rushing to and from their gates, announcements echoing through the terminals. But in here, time seemed to have stopped, trapped between the present and that bloody day on a mountain in Vietnam. The silence was broken by another knock at the door. This time, when it opened, a man in a sharp military uniform stepped in, his insignia indicating he was from the Pentagon's Public Affairs Office. But before he could speak, before the story could move forward into whatever was coming next, Harrison had one more thing to say. You know what I remember most? He said, his eyes focused on something far away. Not the gunfire, not the medals, not even the men we lost. I remember the silence afterward, when we finally took that hill and the gun stopped and we looked down at the valley below. In that moment, we were all just boys again, wondering how we'd ever find our way back home. The Pentagon officer waited respectfully, understanding that some stories needed to be finished before new ones could begin. What was about to happen would change many lives, but first, the past had to be heard. The truth of Hamburger Hill, carried for 50 years in the heart of an old soldier, was finally finding its voice. Harrison sat quietly as the Pentagon officer introduced himself as Major Thomas Bradley. The Major's presence brought a new energy to the room, a sense that something larger was beginning to unfold. Behind him, 2 more military officers had appeared in the doorway, their faces showing clear recognition of the Medal of Honor on the table. "Sergeant Harrison," Major Bradley began, his voice carrying the polished tone of someone used to handling sensitive situations, "we received word of your presence here through several channels. There are some people in Washington very interested in speaking with you." Harrison's expression remained unchanged. "Been a long time since Washington was interested in anything I had to say, Major." The young TSA agent shifted uncomfortably in his chair, beginning to understand just how significant his earlier confrontation had been. Martinez, the supervisor, stepped forward. "Major, I want to take full responsibility for how this situation was handled." Bradley raised a hand, stopping her. "Actually, that's part of why I'm here. This incident has already gained significant attention. Videos are circulating on social media, and several news organizations have picked up the story." He paused, looking directly at Harrison. "Sir, your story is resonating with people, particularly given current discussions about how we treat our veterans." Harrison's right hand stopped its tapping, his full attention now on the Major. "What exactly are you saying?" "The Secretary of Veterans Affairs would like to speak with you. There's also interest from several congressional committees about using this incident to review and reform TSA procedures regarding military veterans and medal recipients." Bradley's voice softened slightly. "Your experience this morning, while regrettable, could help prevent similar situations in the future." The room absorbed this information as Captain Roberts stepped forward. "Sir," he addressed Harrison, "my father would want your story told. All of it, not just Hamburger Hill, but what happened here today." Harrison looked down at the medal on the table, its surface catching the fluorescent light. For 50 years, he'd carried not just the physical weight of that medal, but the responsibility that came with it. The names and faces of those who never came down that mountain had been his alone to remember. Perhaps it was time for that to change. "The young officer," Harrison said suddenly, gesturing to the TSA agent who had confronted him earlier. "What's your name, son?" "Jason Miller, sir," the agent replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Officer Miller did exactly what his training told him to do, Harrison said, addressing the room. "He saw something unusual, and he acted. The problem isn't with him. It's with a system that's forgotten how to recognize its own." Major Bradley nodded slowly, understanding the deeper meaning in Harrison's words. "That's exactly what we hope to address, sir. Would you be willing to share your story? Not just about Vietnam, but about today?" Harrison was quiet for a moment, his eyes moving from face to face in the room. The young agent still learning about respect and duty. The supervisor trying to balance security with dignity. The pilot carrying his father's memories. The older TSA officer who understood the weight of service. And now these Pentagon officials offering a chance to make a difference one more time. "When I came down that mountain," Harrison began slowly, "I made a promise to the men we lost, that their sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten, that their memory would mean something." He reached for the medal, holding it up to the light. "If telling this story can help remind people what that sacrifice means, then yes, Major, I'll tell it." The tension in the room shifted, replaced by a sense of purpose. Outside, the airport continued its endless rhythm of arrivals and departures. But in that small room, something momentous was taking shape. A chance to bridge the gap between past and present, between sacrifice and recognition. Major Bradley pulled out his phone. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like to arrange a direct call with the secretary, and there's someone else who'd like to speak with you." General Richardson from the Joint Chiefs. He was a young lieutenant in the 101st Airborne. Says he never forgot the stories about the ghost of Hamburger Hill. As the major made his calls, Harrison turned to Officer Miller. "Son, come here a moment." The young agent approached cautiously, still carrying the weight of his earlier actions. "Sir, I'm so sorry about—" "No apologies needed," Harrison interrupted gently. "But I want you to understand something. This medal, it's not just about what happened on that mountain. It's about responsibility, about recognizing what matters most when everything is on the line. You're in a position of authority now. How you use that authority, that's what defines you." Miller nodded, tears threatening again. "I understand, sir. I won't forget." "None of us will," Martinez added, her voice firm. "This changes everything." And she was right. As Major Bradley returned to announce that Washington was waiting to speak with Harrison, as news crews began gathering outside the terminal, as social media exploded with the story of what had happened that morning, something fundamental was shifting. The ghost of Hamburger Hill had emerged one last time, not to relive the past, but to change the future. The call from Washington came through on a secure line in the airport's administrative offices. Harrison sat at a polished conference table, surrounded by a growing entourage of military and airport officials. Major Bradley had arranged for the call to be placed on speakerphone, allowing everyone present to witness what was about to unfold. "Mr. Secretary, I have Sergeant James Harrison with me," Major Bradley announced formally. "Sergeant Harrison," a voice filled the room carrying the weight of authority and genuine respect. "This is Secretary Wilson. I want to first express my personal apologies for what occurred this morning, and then to thank you for your extraordinary service to our nation." Harrison leaned forward slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Secretary. But if I may, I'm not interested in apologies. I'm interested in making sure other veterans don't face similar situations." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by what sounded like papers being shuffled. "That's exactly why I'm calling, Sergeant. We've been working on comprehensive reforms for veteran treatment at security checkpoints, but your incident this morning has accelerated things considerably." Another voice joined the call. "Sergeant Harrison, General Richardson here. I was at Fort Campbell when the stories about Hamburger Hill first came back. Never thought I'd have the chance to speak with you directly." Harrison's expression softened slightly at the mention of Fort Campbell. "General, that was a long time ago." "Not long enough to forget, sir," Richardson replied. "The 101st never forgets its heroes, and right now, we have an opportunity to make sure no one else forgets either." The Secretary's voice returned. "Sergeant, we're prepared to take immediate action. I have with me a draft executive order that would create new protocols for veterans traveling with military honors and decorations. But we need your help to get it right." As the officials continued outlining their plans, Harrison's mind drifted momentarily to that morning, to the young TSA agent's face when he first saw the medal, to the crowd's reaction, to the way understanding had transformed confusion into respect. Maybe that was what had been missing all along, understanding. The door to the conference room opened quietly, and Martinez stepped in with an urgent expression. She handed a tablet to Major Bradley, who scanned it quickly before interrupting the call. "Mr. Secretary, I apologize, but you should know the story has gone viral. Major news networks are picking it up. Social media is exploding. There are already calls for congressional hearings." There was a long pause on the line. When the Secretary spoke again, his voice carried a new urgency. "Sergeant Harrison, would you be willing to tell your story? Not just about Vietnam, but about today. The American people need to hear this from you." Before Harrison could respond, General Richardson added, "And there's something else you should know, Sergeant. Since news of this morning's incident broke, we've been contacted by several members of Charlie Company. They want to come to Los Angeles. They want to stand with you again." Harrison's hand found its way to the medal, which he'd returned to its place in his duffel bag. "How many?" he asked quietly. 7 so far, the general replied, including your radio operator, Jimmy Chen's brother, and 3 men you carried off that mountain. They're ready to fly out as soon as we give the word. The room fell silent, waiting for Harrison's response. Major Bradley watched the old soldier carefully, seeing the weight of decision in his eyes. This was more than just a story now. It was becoming a movement. "Mr. Secretary," Harrison finally said, his voice firm and clear, "before I agree to anything, I need your word on something. This can't just be about me or about one incident at one airport. This has to be about all of them, every veteran who's come home carrying memories and medals and scars that most people never see." "You have my word," the secretary responded immediately. "Whatever we do here will create lasting change. No more veterans encountering disrespect or misunderstanding when they travel. No more medals being treated like security threats. Real, systematic change." Harrison nodded slowly, though only those in the room could see it. "Then yes, sir, I'll tell the story. All of it." "Thank you, Sergeant," the secretary said. "We'll have transport arranged for your fellow soldiers within the hour. And Sergeant, welcome back to the fight." As the call ended, Major Bradley turned to Harrison. "Sir, the media is gathering outside. How would you like to proceed?" Harrison stood, his movement deliberate and purposeful. "First, I want to speak with Officer Miller again. He needs to be part of this, needs to understand what his actions this morning set in motion." He paused, looking around the room. "Then we wait for my men. Some stories need to be told by more than one voice." Martinez, who had remained quietly in the corner, stepped forward. "Sir, you should know. Officer Miller's been sitting in the break room since everything happened. He's been reading about Hamburger Hill, about what you did that day. I've never seen him so changed." Harrison smiled slightly. "Good, because what's coming next is going to change a lot more than just one young officer. It's going to change everything." And as if to emphasize his words, the distant sound of camera shutters and reporter voices drifted through the walls, while somewhere above, planes carried more pieces of this unfolding story toward Los Angeles. Old soldiers answering. One last call to stand beside their brother in arms. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through LAX's windows as Harrison made his way back to the TSA break room, Major Bradley and Martinez flanking him like an informal honor guard. The bustle of the airport had taken on a different character. Now, whispers followed their small procession, phones raised to capture photos and videos, passengers pointing in quiet recognition. Officer Jason Miller sat alone at a break room table, his TSA uniform jacket draped over the chair beside him. His phone lay on the table, displaying an article about Hamburger Hill. He stood quickly as Harrison entered, instinctively coming to attention. "At ease, son," Harrison said quietly, pulling up a chair. "Tell me what you've been reading." Miller swallowed hard, glancing at his phone. "Everything I could find, sir. About the battle, about what you did," his voice cracked slightly, "about Tommy Chen and the others." Harrison nodded slowly. "And what have you learned?" Miller paused, collecting himself. "That I did everything wrong this morning. I saw a potential security threat instead of seeing you, seeing what that medal really means." "No," Harrison interrupted gently. "You did your job. The problem isn't with you, Officer Miller. It's with a system that never taught you how to recognize what you were seeing." He reached into his duffel bag, removing the Medal of Honor. "Do you know why I carry this with me everywhere?" Miller shook his head. "Because every time someone sees it, every time someone asks about it, those men on that mountain live again. For a moment, their sacrifices remembered, their story is told." Harrison placed the medal on the table between them. "And now their story is part of your story too." Martinez stepped forward. "Sir, the first of the Charlie Company veterans have landed. They're being escorted here now." Harrison's eyes never left Miller. "Would you like to meet them, son? Would you like to hear the whole story?" Miller's eyes widened. "Sir, after how I treated you." "Sometimes," Harrison said, standing slowly, "the best way to learn about respect is to see it in action. Come on." As they left the break room, the airport's usual sounds were punctuated by a growing murmur from the direction of the main terminal. A crowd had gathered, phones raised, as 5 elderly men in civilian clothes were escorted through security by airport police. Each man carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a soldier, despite the years that had passed. Harrison stepped forward and the crowd parted instinctively. The first veteran to reach him was a tall man with silver hair, moving with the help of a cane. "Ghost," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Been a long time." "Too long, Radio," Harrison replied, embracing his former radio operator, Michael Radio Rodriguez. "Too long." The others gathered around, John Chen, Tommy's brother, who had served in a different company, but heard the stories of how Harrison had tried to save his younger sibling. Marcus Peters and Frank Williams, 2 of the men Harrison had carried down the mountain, and James Cooper, who'd been their platoon medic's assistant and had helped treat Harrison's wounds after the battle. "When we heard what happened," Cooper said, gesturing at the terminal around them, "there was no question. We had to come." Miller stood back, watching in awe as these men, these living pieces of history, reunited. Martinez touched his arm gently. "Watch carefully, Officer Miller. This is what duty and honor look like after 50 years. The veterans formed a loose circle, their conversation low and private at first, sharing memories and updates on their lives. But then Harrison turned, beckoning Miller forward. "This is Officer Miller," he announced to the group. "He's part of this story now." Rodriguez looked the young TSA agent up and down. "So you're the one who found Ghost's medal?" Miller nodded, unable to speak. "Good," Rodriguez said firmly, "because now you get to help us tell the story right." Major Bradley stepped forward. "Gentlemen, the media's waiting. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs has authorized full disclosure of the classified details of your mission on Hamburger Hill. He feels it's time the whole story was told." Harrison looked at his old comrades, seeing in their eyes the same question he'd been asking himself after 50 years of carrying these memories alone. Were they ready to share them with the world? Chen spoke first. Tommy would want the story told, all of it. The others nodded in agreement. Williams, who still walked with a limp from his wounds that day, added, "Not just for us, Jim, for all of them, all the ones who never came home." Harrison turned to Miller. "Still want to hear the whole story, son?" Miller stood straighter, understanding the privilege he was being offered. "Yes, sir. More than anything." "Then, let's do this right," Harrison said, looking at his assembled brothers in arms. "Let's make sure everyone understands what that medal really means." As they moved toward the press conference area that had been hastily assembled, Harrison felt a familiar weight settle onto his shoulders. But this time, he wasn't carrying the burden alone. This time, he had his brothers beside him again, ready to ensure that the truth of Hamburger Hill and the lesson of this morning's encounter would never be forgotten. The story was about to be told, not just by one old soldier, but by all of them. And somewhere Harrison knew Tommy Chen and all the others who never came down that mountain were watching, waiting to live again in the telling. The impromptu press conference area had been set up in a cordoned-off section of Terminal 4. News cameras formed a semicircle around a hastily arranged podium, their red recording lights blinking like artificial stars. Airport officials had managed to create an island of order in the chaos of a busy terminal, though passengers still gathered at the edges, phones raised to capture history in the making. Major Bradley stepped to the podium first, his military bearing commanding immediate attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We're about to hear a story that's been classified for over 50 years. A story about valor, sacrifice, and a medal that represents the highest ideals of our nation." He paused, scanning the assembled crowd. "But this isn't just about what happened on a mountain in Vietnam. It's about how we recognize and honor that sacrifice today. With us are 6 members of Charlie Company, 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, men who fought together on Hamburger Hill and who have reunited today because of what happened in this very terminal this morning. Harrison and his fellow veterans stood in a line behind the podium, their civilian clothes unable to mask their military bearing. Officer Miller stood slightly apart, his TSA uniform a stark reminder of how this story had begun. First, Bradley continued, I want to read the official citation for Sergeant James Harrison's Medal of Honor, declassified in full for the first time today. He produced a document, its official seals clearly visible. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty while serving as a squad leader with Charlie Company. On May 20, 1969, during Operation Apache Snow, as Bradley read, Rodriguez leaned close to Harrison. They never knew the whole story, Ghost, about the bunker, about what really happened after you got Dave out. Harrison nodded slightly. Maybe it's time they did. The citation painted a picture of heroism, multiple trips into enemy fire to rescue wounded comrades, severe injuries sustained but ignored, leadership that inspired others to keep fighting. But it was clinical, military, stripped of the human cost that Harrison and his brothers had carried for 50 years. When Bradley finished, he stepped back, and Harrison moved to the podium. The medal hung around his neck now, its weight familiar, yet somehow different in this new context. What you just heard, Harrison began, his voice steady, is the official version. But there's another story, a harder story, about young men who became brothers, about promises made on a blood-soaked mountain, and about how those promises echo through the years. He gestured to his companions. These men, we were just boys, really. Tommy Chen was 18 when he died in my arms, asking me to tell his brother he wasn't afraid. John Chen wiped his eyes quietly. Dave Roberts was 20, carrying a picture of his newborn son. That son grew up to become a pilot and was here this morning when all this started. Harrison's right hand found its familiar rhythm against the podium. We made a promise up there that we'd never forget, that we'd carry their memories home. That's why I wear this medal, not for what I did, but for what they gave. He turned slightly, looking directly at Officer Miller. This morning, when this young man was doing his job, he saw a metal object that needed to be checked. What he couldn't see was 50 years of memories, of promises kept, of brothers lost and found. Miller stepped forward then, his voice shaking but clear. I didn't understand what I was looking at, but now I do. And I think everyone needs to hear this story. Rodriguez moved to stand beside Harrison. Tell them about the bunker, Ghost, about what happened after you got Dave out. Harrison closed his eyes briefly, the memories sharp and clear despite the decades. After I got Dave to safety, I heard more calls for help. The NVA had a bunker complex near the summit with interlocking fields of fire. No one could get through, but I could hear our men up there calling for help. He opened his eyes, looking out at the captivated audience. The official record says I was hit 3 times. Truth is, it was 5. 2 rounds caught me as I reached the bunker. But inside were 3 more of our boys, still alive, still fighting. Williams spoke up from behind him. We thought he was dead. No one could have survived that approach. But then we heard the grenades, saw the bunker explode, and, through the smoke, here comes Ghost, carrying Tommy Parker on his back. The medal citation doesn't mention that part, Harrison continued, about how Tommy died an hour later in the med station, about how his last words were about his mother's apple pie, about how every time I smell apples baking, I'm back on that mountain. The press room had fallen completely silent. Even the usual airport announcements seemed muted, as if the terminal itself was listening to this piece of history finally being told in full. So when you see this medal, Harrison said, his voice growing stronger, don't just see the medal and ribbon, see Tommy Chen smile, see Dave Roberts' baby picture, see 19-year-old boys becoming men in mud and blood and rain, see promises kept for 50 years. He turned to Miller again, and see a young man learning what it really means to serve. Because that's what this morning taught us all, that these stories aren't just about the past. They're about how we honor that past, here and now, every single day. The cameras continued rolling as Harrison stepped back, making way for his brothers to tell their parts of the story. The truth of Hamburger Hill was finally emerging, not just as a military operation, but as a human story of love, loss, and promises, kept through the long march of years. The story spread like wildfire across social media platforms and news networks. Within hours of the press conference, the Hamburger Hill and Hocker Sergeant Harrison were trending nationwide. Video clips of Harrison and his fellow veterans telling their story were being shared millions of times, each news share bringing their message of honor and remembrance to a new audience. In the airport's VIP lounge, now converted into a temporary headquarters for this unfolding event, Harrison and his companions watched as their story took on a life of its own. Major Bradley stood by a wall-mounted television, flipping between news channels that were all carrying the same story. CNN's running it as their lead, he reported. Fox News, MSNBC, all of them. The Secretary's office says they're being flooded with calls. Veterans groups across the country are organizing. Rodriguez shook his head in wonder. 50 years we kept these stories to ourselves. Now the whole world's hearing them. On one screen, a viral video showed the moment when Harrison's medal had fallen from his bag, now overlaid with dramatic music and captions explaining its significance. Another channel was running interviews with military historians discussing the strategic importance of Hamburger Hill and the classified details that had just been revealed. John Chen's phone buzzed constantly with messages from the Vietnamese American community. They're organizing a memorial service, he said quietly. For Tommy and all the others, both American and Vietnamese veterans want to attend. Officer Miller, who had been given permission to remain with the group, sat in a corner watching a live stream on his phone. "Sir," he called to Harrison, "you need to see this." The others gathered around as Miller held up his phone. On the screen, a young woman was recording herself, tears in her eyes. "My grandfather died last year," she was saying. "He served in Vietnam, but he never talked about it. Seeing these men today, hearing their stories, I finally understand what he carried all those years. Please, if you're a veteran watching this, tell your story. We need to hear it." The video had already garnered over 1 million views. "It's not just about us anymore," Harrison observed softly. "It's about all of them. All the stories that never got told." Williams nodded. "Maybe that's what today was really about. Maybe that medal was meant to fall out of your bag, Ghost. Meant to start all this." Martinez entered the lounge, her face animated with fresh news. "Sir, you won't believe what's happening. TSA agents across the country are posting their own stories. Veterans they've met, medals they've seen. There's a movement starting among our officers. They want better training, better protocols for identifying and honoring military decorations." She handed Harrison a tablet showing a forum where TSA agents were sharing their experiences. One post caught his eye. "Today, I learned what real honor looks like. I've been doing this job for 10 years, but I never understood what these medals truly mean. That changes today. Remember Hamburger Hill." Major Bradley's phone rang. After a brief conversation, he turned to the group. "Gentlemen, the Secretary of Veterans Affairs is flying in personally. He'll be here in 3 hours, and he's bringing something with him. The original flag that flew over your position on Hamburger Hill. It's been in the Pentagon's archives all these years." The room fell silent at this news. That flag represented more than just a battle. It was a physical link to the brothers they'd lost, to the promises they'd made, to the young men they'd been. "There's more," Bradley continued. "The President has seen the coverage. He wants to make a formal announcement about new protocols for veterans traveling with military honors. They're calling it the Harrison Protocol." Miller stood straighter. "Sir, what exactly will that mean?" Harrison turned to the young officer. "It means, son, that what happened this morning will never happen again, but more importantly, it means that every veteran who passes through these checkpoints will be seen, really seen, for who they are and what they carried for this country." Cooper, who had been quiet for most of the afternoon, spoke up. "Jim, remember what Lieutenant Wells used to say? About how the hardest part of being a soldier isn't the fighting, It's making sure people understand what you fought for?" Harrison nodded, remembering their fallen lieutenant's words as if they had been spoken yesterday. "Well," Cooper continued, "I think we finally did it. We made them understand." Outside the lounge windows, the afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow across the terminal. Passengers continued their eternal flow through the airport, but now many of them paused as they passed the lounge, recognizing the men inside, offering silent salutes or simply standing in respectful observation. The story of Hamburger Hill had waited 50 years to be told in full. Now that it had been, it was changing more than just protocols and procedures. It was changing hearts and minds, one story at a time. And somewhere, Harrison thought, Tommy Chen was smiling, knowing that his sacrifice and the sacrifice of all the others would never be forgotten again. As the sun continued its descent over Los Angeles, casting long shadows through LAX's massive windows, the Medal of Honor's journey had taken on new meaning. Harrison sat with his fellow veterans in the VIP lounge, watching as Major Bradley coordinated with airport officials for the secretary's arrival. But it wasn't just the medal's story being told anymore. It was the story of every decoration, every ribbon, every badge of honor that veterans carried with them. "Look at this," Rodriguez said, holding up his phone. The screen showed a video from another airport, Dallas-Fort Worth. A TSA agent there had recognized a Vietnam veteran's air medal, stopped the line, and called for a proper honor guard. The whole terminal had applauded. "It's happening everywhere," Martinez added, scrolling through reports on her tablet. "Atlanta, Chicago, Miami. TSA agents are pulling veterans aside, but not for additional screening, for recognition. They're studying their medals, learning the stories, sharing them with passengers." Harrison listened, his weathered hands resting on the table before him. The medal around his neck caught the fading sunlight, throwing golden reflections across the room. "Tommy would have loved this," he said quietly. "He always said the hardest part wasn't the fighting. It was coming home to people who couldn't understand." John Chen nodded, wiping moisture from his eyes. "My brother wrote me a letter a week before." He paused, collecting himself. He said he was more scared of being forgotten than he was of dying. But now everyone knows his name. The door opened, and Captain Roberts entered, still in his pilot's uniform. "Just got word from the tower. Secretary's plane is 30 minutes out." He looked at Harrison with deep respect. "My father, he would have been so proud to see this day." Miller, who had been monitoring social media on his phone, suddenly sat up straighter. "Sir, you need to see this. It's going viral." He held out his phone, showing a split-screen video. On one side was the security footage from that morning, Harrison being confronted, the medal falling from his bag. On the other side was current footage from airports across the country, showing TSA agents standing at attention as veterans passed through security, honor guards being formed spontaneously, medals being treated with the reverence they deserved. The caption read, "This morning, we forgot. Tonight, we remember. One should never again. Harrison Protocol." "It's not just about protocols anymore," Miller said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's about changing how we see things, how we see people." Williams, who had been quiet for a while, spoke up. "Remember that night before the final assault, when Lieutenant Wells gathered us all together?" The veterans nodded, remembering their fallen leader. "He told us something I never forgot," Williams continued. "Boys," he said, "what we do tomorrow isn't just about taking a hill, it's about who we become in the process." I didn't understand what he meant then, but I do now. Cooper reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I've carried this since that day. It's the list of medications I gave out during the battle. Every name, every wound, every man we lost." His voice cracked. "For 50 years, I've been the only one who knew what was on this list. Maybe it's time that changed, too." Harrison reached across the table, gently taking the paper. "Read it with me, Doc. Let's make sure they're all remembered." As Cooper began reading the names, Martinez quietly activated her phone's camera, understanding the historical significance of the moment. One by one, the names of the fallen echoed through the VIP lounge, After each name, Harrison or one of the others would add a detail, a hometown, a nickname, a last word spoken on that blood-soaked mountain. Private Thomas Chen, San Francisco. Loved to sing Beatles songs during patrol. Corporal Michael Hayes, Boston, carried his little sister's photo in his helmet. Private First Class James Morrison, Kansas City, was going to be a teacher when he got home. The list went on, each name carrying its own weight of memory and loss. By the time they finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even Major Bradley had to turn away for a moment to compose himself. The airport's PA system crackled to life. Attention all personnel. Secretary of Veterans Affairs arriving in 15 minutes. Security detail to Gate 7. Harrison stood slowly, the others rising with him. Before we go out there, he said, looking at each of his brothers in turn, I want you all to understand something. What's happening today, it's bigger than us, bigger than Hamburger Hill. It's about making sure that 50 years from now, some other old soldier won't have to explain why his medals matter. Miller stepped forward. Sir, I promise you, as long as I wear this uniform, no veteran will ever have to explain again. Outside the lounge, the terminal had taken on an almost ceremonial atmosphere. Word had spread about the Secretary's imminent arrival. Passengers lined the corridors, many holding phones, others simply waiting in respectful silence. The story of Hamburger Hill was about to add another chapter, but this one wasn't about war or loss. It was about recognition, remembrance, and a nation finally understanding the true weight of the medals its warriors carried. The Secretary's arrival transformed Terminal 4 into something between a military ceremony and a public awakening. Airport police had created a corridor through the crowd, while TSA agents, led by Martinez, formed an impromptu honor guard. The usual cacophony of airport announcements and rolling luggage had been replaced by a respectful hush. Secretary Wilson emerged from the jet bridge, flanked by military aides. But what drew everyone's attention was what he carried. A triangular wooden case clearly aged, with the insignia of the 101st Airborne Division barely visible on its weathered surface. Harrison and his fellow veterans stood at attention as the Secretary approached. Behind them, Officer Miller and his TSA colleagues maintained their own rigid posture, understanding now the weight of the moment. Sergeant Harrison, the Secretary, began, his voice carrying across the silent terminal. 50 years ago, this flag flew over Hamburger Hill. It was raised by members of Charlie Company after 10 days of combat that tested the limits of human courage and sacrifice. He paused, looking at each of the veterans in turn. Today, it returns to its rightful guardians. With careful movements, he opened the wooden case. The flag inside was faded, bearing the marks of battle and time, but its stars and stripes still spoke of valor and sacrifice. The smell of aged canvas carried hints of gunpowder and rain-soaked earth, the very essence of that distant mountain. Rodriguez stepped forward, his hand trembling slightly as he touched the fabric. I remember when we raised it, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Lieutenant Wells had carried it the whole way up, said we needed to show them we made it. Show who? Miller asked softly from behind them. The ones who didn't? Make it to the top, Harrison answered. We raised it for them. The Secretary nodded to his aides, who began setting up a small podium. News cameras, which had been filming from a respectful distance, moved closer. The story of Hamburger Hill was about to gain another chapter. Before I make the formal announcement about the Harrison Protocol, the Secretary said, I want everyone here to understand something. He gestured to the gathered crowd of travelers, airport staff, and media. What happened this morning wasn't just about a medal being mishandled. It was about our nation's need to remember, truly remember, what these decorations mean. He turned to Miller. Officer Miller, would you step forward, please? The young TSA agent moved forward, his face a mixture of apprehension and pride. Your actions this morning, while following existing protocols, highlighted a critical gap in our system. But more importantly, your response afterward, your willingness to learn, to understand, to change, exemplifies exactly what we need from all our security personnel. Miller stood straighter. Sir, I just wish I had known sooner, known what that medal really meant. That's exactly why we're here, the secretary continued. The Harrison Protocol isn't just about new procedures, it's about education, recognition, and respect. He produced a document from his briefcase. Effective immediately, every TSA checkpoint in the nation will have specially trained personnel to identify military decorations. Every agent will receive comprehensive training about the significance of these honors. And most importantly, every veteran passing through our airports will be treated with the dignity they've earned. The announcement was met with applause that echoed through the terminal, but Harrison noticed something else. Passengers were putting down their phones, turning to elderly men and women among them, asking questions, listening to stories that had gone untold for too long. John Chen stepped forward. Mr. Secretary, my brother Tommy, before he died on that mountain, he made us promise something. Promise that people back home would understand what we did there, what we lost. And that's exactly what's happening. Now, the Secretary responded, not just here, but across the country. We're receiving reports from every major airport. Veterans are being recognized, honors are being rendered, stories are being shared. Cooper, who still held his medical list, spoke up. Sir, there's something else we'd like to propose. Something that might help make sure this continues. Harrison nodded, knowing what his friend was thinking. We'd like to help with the training. Not just us, but veterans from all eras. Let us tell our stories, share our experiences, help your agents understand what these medals and decorations really mean. The Secretary's face lit up. That's exactly the kind of initiative we need. In fact, he turned to Martinez. Supervisor Martinez, would you be willing to coordinate this effort? Work with these gentlemen to develop a training program that could be implemented nationwide? Martinez straightened with pride. It would be my honor, sir. As the formal proceedings continued, Harrison noticed Miller had stepped back slightly, watching the scene with intense concentration. He moved to join the young officer. Having second thoughts about this morning, son? Miller shook his head. No, sir. I'm having first thoughts about tomorrow, about all the tomorrows to come, and how we can make sure every veteran who passes through these checkpoints feels the respect they deserve. Harrison placed a hand on Miller's shoulder. Then you've learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes it takes a mistake to show us the right path forward. Above them, the airport's PA system crackled one last time, but instead of the usual announcements, a different message played. Attention all passengers. Today, Terminal 4 witnessed history. The Harrison Protocol marks a new chapter in how we honor our veterans. Please take a moment to thank those who served and remember those who sacrificed everything for our freedom. The flag from Hamburger Hill rippled slightly in the air conditioning, its battle-worn fabric catching the last rays of sunlight. And in that moment, Harrison could almost hear Lieutenant Wells' voice again. Boys, what we do tomorrow isn't just about taking a hill. It's about who we become in the process. 50 years later, they were still becoming, still learning, still teaching, still honoring the promises made on a distant mountain. And now, thanks to one morning's incident, those promises would be kept for generations to come. As evening settled over LAX, the story of Hamburger Hill and its aftermath continued to ripple outward. The VIP lounge had become a temporary museum of memory, with veterans from other conflicts beginning to arrive. Drawn by the viral videos and news coverage, each brought their own medals, their own stories, their own pieces of history waiting to be heard. A Marine Corps veteran from Desert Storm shared space with an Air Force pilot who'd flown in Kosovo. A young Army sergeant who'd served in Afghanistan sat listening intently as Harrison and his companions continued sharing their stories. The generations of American warriors were bridging decades of experience, united by common understanding. Tell them about the rain, Ghost, Rodriguez urged, seeing how the younger veterans hung on every word, about how it never seemed to stop. Harrison nodded slowly, his right hand finding its familiar rhythm. 17 days of rain. The mud was so deep it would swallow your boots. But that wasn't the worst part. He looked at the younger veterans. The worst part was the waiting. Between attacks, between moments of chaos, there was just the rain and your thoughts. The Desert Storm veteran, a woman named Sarah Collins, nodded in understanding. Sand for us. Got into everything, just like your rain. Made you feel like you'd never be clean again. Different wars, same soldiers, Cooper observed quietly. We all carried something back. Miller, who had remained with the group throughout. The evening was taking notes. Martinez had assigned him to help develop the new training protocols, and he was determined to capture every detail, every nuance of what these decorations meant to those who'd earned them. "Sir," he addressed Harrison, "something's been bothering me. This morning, when I first saw the medal, why didn't you just tell me what it was right away?" The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Harrison. It was a question that cut to the heart of everything that had happened that day. "Because, son," Harrison replied carefully, "that's not what the medal is for. It's not meant to be a pass or a privilege. It's a responsibility, a reminder." He touched the medal at his throat. "Every time someone asks about it, every time someone sees it, I have to tell their story, not mine, theirs, the ones who never came home." The Afghanistan veteran, Sergeant Maya Rodriguez, no relation to Harrison's radio man, wiped her eyes. "We have our own hills now, different names, different wars, but the same weight. That's why this matters so much," Martinez added, gesturing to her tablet, where the Harrison Protocol documentation was taking shape. "It's not just about recognizing medals, it's about recognizing the stories behind them." A commotion at the Beidou's daughter drew their attention. A group of Vietnamese-American community leaders had arrived, led by John Chen's contacts. They carried flowers and, more importantly, photographs, old black and white images of Hamburger Hill taken from the other side. "We brought these," their spokesman said softly, "because healing happens when both sides remember together." Harrison rose slowly, approaching the photographs. There, in grainy black and white, was the mountain as the NVA had seen it. The same slopes he'd climbed, the same bunkers he'd assaulted, but from a different perspective. The weight of history felt heavier, somehow more complete. "Your soldiers were brave too," he said to the Vietnamese delegation. "They fought hard for what they believed in." The spokesman nodded. "And now we are here together, remembering so. We can move forward." Miller watched this exchange with growing understanding. The morning's confrontation at the security checkpoint hadn't just been about a medal being mishandled. It had been about the need to recognize the full complexity of sacrifice, courage, and memory. The door opened again, this time admitting Major Bradley with fresh news. "The Harrison Protocol is being fast-tracked. Training materials are being developed right now. But there's something else." He paused, making sure he had everyone's attention. "The Smithsonian has called. They want to create an exhibit about this, about today, about Hamburger Hill, about how a single moment in an airport changed how America recognizes its veterans." The impact of this announcement rippled through the room. The story was no longer just about one morning's incident or one soldier's medal. It was becoming part of the larger narrative of how nations remember, how they honor sacrifice, how they learn from their moments of oversight and turn them into opportunities for growth. Harrison looked around the room, at the veterans from different eras sharing their stories, at the Vietnamese delegation with their photographs, at Miller taking his careful notes, at Martinez crafting new protocols that would change everything. 50 years ago on a rain-soaked mountain, he'd made a promise to remember. Now that promise was transforming into something larger than he'd ever imagined. "Ghost," Rodriguez said softly, using the old nickname. "Remember what Lieutenant Wells used to say about ripples?" Harrison nodded. "That every action creates ripples, and you never know how far they'll spread or what shores they'll touch." "Well," Rodriguez gestured at the room full of veterans, officials, and witnesses to history, "I think these ripples are just beginning." And he was right. The story of Hamburger Hill, reborn in a modern airport terminal, was reaching across generations, across conflicts, across old divisions. It was becoming a bridge between past and present, between those who served and those who needed to understand that service. The medal that had fallen from Harrison's bag that morning had started something that wouldn't end with new protocols or training programs. It had started a conversation that would echo through the corridors of memory for years to come. Night had fallen over Los Angeles, but LAX's Terminal 4 blazed with activity. The day's events had triggered a cascade of policy changes that were spreading across the nation's transportation network. In the Operations Center, Martinez coordinated, with TSA leadership from other major airports, all eager to implement the Harrison Protocol before the next sunrise. O'Hare is already modifying their training procedures, she reported to the assembled group. Atlanta, Dallas, Miami, they're all following suit. By morning, every TSA checkpoint in the country will have new guidelines for handling military decorations. Secretary Wilson, who had delayed his return to Washington to help manage the transformation, nodded approvingly. How are the agents responding to the changes? Miller stepped forward, tablet in hand. Sir, we're seeing something unprecedented. TSA agents across the country are voluntarily staying past their shifts to undergo immediate training. Many are sharing their own connections to military service, parents, siblings, children who served. It's becoming personal for everyone. The secretary turned to Harrison and his fellow veterans. You've started something remarkable, gentlemen. This isn't just about airport security anymore. It's about changing how America recognizes its warriors. Harrison sat with the battle-worn flag from Hamburger Hill carefully folded in his lap. The events of the day had exhausted him, but there was a light in his eyes that his companions hadn't seen in years. Mr. Secretary, there's something else we need to discuss. The room quieted, sensing the importance of what was coming. This morning, when that medal fell out of my bag, it wasn't an accident. Harrison's words drew surprised looks from everyone except his fellow veterans. I've carried it through airports for 50 years, always packed the same way, always secured, carefully. But today, he paused, gathering his thoughts. Rodriguez finished for him. Today you packed it differently, loosely, almost like it was meant to fall out, Harrison confirmed. Because sometimes the only way to start a conversation is to create a moment that demands attention. The secretary leaned forward. You mean? I mean that for 50 years, we've watched veterans struggle to be recognized, watched medals and decorations treated like suspicious objects, watched the gap grow between those who served and those who never understood that service. Harrison's voice grew stronger. So, yes, this morning I made a choice, not to create conflict, but to create awareness. Miller sat down heavily, the full impact of this revelation hitting him. You knew how we'd react. You knew the protocols would force us to examine the medal. Harrison nodded. What I didn't know, couldn't have known, was how that moment would grow into this. He gestured around the room. Into all of you, into these changes, into this chance to make things right. The Vietnamese delegation's spokesman, who had remained to help with cultural sensitivity training, spoke up. In our tradition, we have a saying, the teacher appears when the student is ready. Perhaps America was finally ready to learn this lesson. Martinez's tablet chimed with incoming messages. Sir, you need to see this. Police and fire departments across the country are reaching out. They want to implement similar protocols for identifying and honoring veterans during routine interactions. The ripple effect is growing. Cooper pulled out his medical list, now laminated by airport staff to preserve it. Jim, remember how we talked about leaving something behind? Something that would last? He smiled softly. I think we finally did it. The secretary's aide approached with urgent news. Sir, the president has seen the coverage. He wants to hold a ceremony at the White House next week, not just to officially implement the Harrison Protocol, but to honor all the men of Hamburger Hill, including those who never came home. Harrison's hand found the medal at his throat. Tommy Chen's brother should speak at that ceremony, and Dave Roberts' son, and every family member of every man we lost up there. Let them tell the stories we've carried all these years. They will, the secretary assured him. But first, there's something else, something immediate. He nodded to Martinez, who activated the airport's PA system. Her voice, clear and strong, echoed through every terminal. "Attention, all passengers and staff. 50 years ago, a group of young men climbed a mountain in Vietnam. Some never came down. Today, one of those men reminded us what their sacrifice truly means. The Harrison Protocol is now in effect at all TSA checkpoints. To any veterans traveling through our airports, you are seen, you are honored, you are remembered." The announcement triggered spontaneous applause throughout the terminal. But in their private room, Harrison and his companions sat in contemplative silence, each lost in memories of rain-soaked earth and promises made long ago. Miller broke the silence with a question that cut to the heart of everything. "Sir, what happens tomorrow?" When the media moves on, when the excitement fades. Harrison smiled, the kind of smile that carried 50 years of wisdom. "Tomorrow, son, you and every other TSA agent in this country will have a choice. When you see a medal, when you meet a veteran, when you hold someone's memories in your hands, you'll choose how to honor them. And because of today, you'll understand exactly what that choice means." Outside, the last flights of the day were arriving and departing, carrying with them the story of what had happened in Terminal 4. But inside, among the old soldiers and those who had learned to understand them, something more precious was taking flight. The realization that some stories need to be told again and again until everyone understands their weight and worth. Dawn broke over LAX the next morning, painting the sky in shades of promise. Harrison stood at the terminal's vast windows, watching as the first flights of the day taxied into position. Behind him, Miller adjusted his TSA uniform, preparing for his first shift under the new protocols. "Nervous, son?" Harrison asked, not turning from the window. "Yes, sir," Miller admitted. "Everything's different now. Everything matters more." "Everything always mattered," Harrison corrected gently. "We just didn't always see it." The morning news shows were running continuous coverage of yesterday's events. Every major network had picked up the story, their broadcasts mixing historical footage of Hamburger Hill with scenes from the airport. Harrison's fellow veterans had departed late last night, heading home to their families, but their presence still lingered in the terminal's transformed atmosphere. Martinez approached, carrying fresh printouts of the Harrison Protocol guidelines. "First shift change is happening now. Every agent has been briefed, but we'd like you both to be present. Your perspectives matter." They made their way to the Akyab TSA briefing room where the morning shift was gathering. The usual chatter died away as Harrison entered, replaced by respectful attention. These men and women had watched yesterday's events unfold on social media, had seen the videos, had read the stories. Now they were about to become part of the change. "Before we begin," Martinez announced, "Officer Miller has something to share." Miller stepped forward, his earlier nervousness replaced by conviction. "Yesterday morning, I made a mistake. Not because I followed procedure, but because I failed to see beyond it. Today, we start fixing that mistake, not just here, but across the country." He held up a familiar object, a TSA training manual, now bearing a new section titled The Harrison Protocol, Recognizing and Honoring Military Service. "This manual tells us how to identify threats," Miller continued. "Now it also tells us how to identify honor. Every medal has a story. Every decoration carries a weight we need to understand. And every veteran who passes through our checkpoints deserves to have that understanding reflected in how we treat them." Harrison watched from the back of the room as Miller walked the agents through the new procedures. The young officer had spent hours working with Martinez to craft guidelines that balanced security requirements with respect and recognition. Now, watching him teach others, Harrison saw something of Lieutenant Wells in his bearing, the same dedication to making sure important lessons were properly passed on. The briefing room door opened and a familiar face entered. Captain Roberts, in his pilot's uniform, ready for his morning flight. "May I?" he asked Martinez, who nodded and stepped aside. Roberts addressed the assembled agents. "My father carried a picture of me the day Sergeant Harrison saved his life on Hamburger Hill. I was just a baby then, but that picture, that moment, shaped everything I became. Yesterday taught us that every veteran carries something similar: memories, obligations, honors that most of us never see. Your job isn't just to check their bags anymore. It's to recognize what they carry in their hearts. The impact of his words was visible on every face in the room. These weren't just new procedures they were learning. This was a new way of seeing, of understanding, of honoring. A young agent raised her hand. "Sir," she addressed Harrison, "how will we know? I mean, not every veteran wears their medals. Not every decoration is visible." Harrison smiled. "That's the most important lesson of all. You won't always know, which means you treat everyone with the respect these honors deserve, because the person passing through your checkpoint might be carrying a silver star in their bag or a purple day, heart in their wallet, or memories of fallen comrades in their heart." Miller added, "The Harrison Protocol isn't just about recognizing medals. It's about recognizing the human beings who earned them." Martinez distributed the final copies of the new guidelines. "Your screens have been updated with images of all military decorations. Your scanners have been calibrated to recognize their unique metallurgical signatures. But most importantly, you've been given something no technology can replace: understanding." As the briefing concluded and agents moved to their posts, Harrison noticed something different in their movements, their bearing. They carried themselves with new purpose, new awareness. The weight of responsibility he'd carried for 50 years was being shared, transformed, renewed in these young hands. Miller touched the manual in his pocket. "Ghost," he said, using Harrison's old nickname for the first time. "Was it worth it? The wait? The planning? The moment you decided to let that medal fall?" Harrison watched as the first passengers of the day began flowing through the terminal. Among them was an elderly man wearing a Korean War veteran's cap, making his way slowly toward security. "Watch," Harrison said softly. The veteran approached the checkpoint. The TSA agent, one who had just completed the briefing, straightened visibly. "Good morning, sir," they heard him say. "Thank you for your service. Would you please tell me about your time in Korea?" The old veteran's face lit up with surprise and gratitude. As he began to share his story, other passengers paused to listen. The moment expanded, rippled, touched everyone within reach. "That's your answer," Harrison told Miller. "That's what yesterday was for. That's what tomorrow will be about." The sun continued its rise over Los Angeles, its light catching the medals and memories that would pass through this terminal today. And in that light, something new was growing, a bridge between those who served and those who needed to understand that service, built on the foundation of one medal's journey and one morning's transformation. 1 week later, Harrison stood in the East Room of the White House, surrounded by familiar faces and new allies. The Medal of Honor hung at his throat, but he wasn't alone in wearing honors now. Veterans from every conflict since World War II had gathered for this moment, their medals and decorations gleaming under the historic chandeliers. Miller and Martinez had flown in from Los Angeles, representing the TSA's commitment to the changes they'd helped create. In the weeks since that transformative morning at LAX, over 10,000 veterans had been recognized and honored at security checkpoints across the nation. Each encounter had added another thread to the tapestry of understanding that was being woven. "Hard to believe it's only been 7 days, Rodriguez said softly, standing beside his old friend. "Feels like everything's different now." Harrison nodded, watching as John Chen spoke quietly with a group of Vietnamese American veterans who had been invited to participate in the ceremony. The healing that had begun in that airport terminal was spreading, touching lives and communities in ways none of them had anticipated. The president entered the room, and the assembled crowd rose in respect. But instead of proceeding directly to the podium, he made his way to where Harrison and his fellow veterans stood. "Sergeant Harrison," the president said warmly, "before we make this official, I want you to know something. What you started, what all of you created, it's changing more than just airport security. It's changing how America sees and honors its veterans, Harrison straightened. That's all we ever wanted, Mr. President, for people to understand. The formal ceremony began with a video compilation, security footage from that morning at LAX, interviews with veterans who had experienced the new protocols, testimonials from TSA agents whose perspectives had been transformed. The final image showed the battle-worn flag from Hamburger Hill, now destined for a permanent display at the Smithsonian. Secretary Wilson took the podium first. 1 week ago, a Medal of Honor recipient was questioned at an airport security checkpoint. What could have become a moment of controversy instead became a catalyst for change. Today, we formalized that change. He gestured to Miller, who approached carrying a leather-bound volume. The Harrison Protocol is now official policy across all transportation security operations in the United States. But it's more than just a set of procedures. It's a commitment to understanding, respect, and recognition. The President rose to sign the executive order, but before he did, he called Harrison forward. "Sergeant, would you share with everyone why you chose that morning to let your medal be seen?" A hush fell over the room as Harrison spoke. 50 years ago, on a mountain in Vietnam, I made a promise to dying men that their sacrifice would be remembered, their courage honored, their story told. But as the years passed, I watched as medals became objects of suspicion, as veterans struggled to be recognized, as the gap between military and civilian life grew wider. He touched the medal at his throat. This medal was never about me. It was about them, about Tommy Chen's smile, about Dave Roberts' baby picture, about Lieutenant Wells' leadership, about all the promises we made to each other in mud and rain and blood. That morning at LAX, I decided it was time to keep those promises in a new way. The President nodded gravely, and in doing so, you've helped us keep our promise to every veteran, the promise that their service will be honored, their sacrifice remembered. The signing ceremony proceeded, but it was what came next that truly captured the spirit of what had been achieved. One by one, veterans in the room began sharing their stories. A Desert Storm Marine spoke of sand and heat and brotherhood. An Afghanistan veteran described mountains that echoed Hamburger Hill's challenges. A Cold War pilot recalled missions that never made headlines but kept the peace. Miller, standing with his fellow TSA representatives, listened intently to each story. The training manual in his pocket felt heavier now, weighted with the responsibility of ensuring these stories would be heard and honored. Martinez leaned close to Harrison. "It's really happening, isn't it? The change we talked about?" Harrison watched as a young Capitol Hill intern asked a Korean War veteran about the medals on his jacket, genuine interest shining in her eyes. "Yes," he replied. "This is just the beginning." The ceremony concluded with an honor guard presenting arms as the battle flag from Hamburger Hill was formally transferred to the Smithsonian's custody. But even as the official events wound down, small groups formed throughout the room. Veterans and civilians, young and old, all engaged in the simple but profound act of sharing and listening. Cooper, who had been quiet for much of the ceremony, finally spoke. "You know what Lieutenant Wells would say about all this, Ghost?" Harrison smiled, remembering their fallen leader's wisdom, that the hardest battles aren't always fought with weapons. "That's right," Cooper nodded. "Sometimes they're fought with memory, with understanding, with the courage to make people see what really matters." As the afternoon light filtered through the White House windows, Harrison looked around the room one last time. The medal at his throat caught the sunlight, throwing reflections that danced across faces, both familiar and new. In those reflections, he saw the future, a future where every veteran's story would be heard, where every medal's weight would be understood, where the promises made on distant battlefields would finally, fully be kept. 1 month after the White House ceremony, Harrison found himself back at LAX's Terminal 4. The changes were immediately visible. New signs explaining the Harrison Protocol, TSA agents wearing special pins indicating their training in military, honors recognition, and most notably, a permanent display case near the security checkpoint. Inside that case lay photographs and artifacts, telling the story of that transformative morning. Images from Hamburger Hill, the first printed copy of the Harrison Protocol, and statements from veterans whose lives had been touched by the changes that followed. But it was the central photograph that drew most travelers' attention, the moment when Harrison's Medal of Honor had fallen from his bag, captured forever as the spark that ignited a revolution in recognition. Miller, now promoted to lead the TSA's Veteran Recognition Training Program, stood beside Harrison as they watched the morning crowd flow through security. Every few minutes, they witnessed the protocol in action, an agent recognizing a veteran, a respectful conversation, a moment of connection between those who served and those who sought to understand that service. "Sometimes I still can't believe how much has changed," Miller said, adjusting his new supervisor's badge. "Just this morning, we had a Vietnam veteran come through, Bronze Star recipient. Before the protocol, we might never have known his story. Now you know to look, to listen, to understand," Harrison finished. "That's what this was always about." Martinez approached, carrying fresh statistics. "The numbers are impressive, sir. In just 1 month, we've documented over 50,000 veteran recognition incidents across U.S. airports. But it's not just the numbers, it's the stories." She handed Harrison a tablet displaying messages from around the country. A World War II veteran's daughter writing about her father crying when TSA agents formed an impromptu honor guard for him. A young Marine's thank you note for being asked about his service. A TSA agent describing how the protocol had helped her connect with her own grandfather's military history. "Ghost," a familiar voice called. They turned to see Rodriguez making his way through the terminal, accompanied by Cooper and several other veterans from different eras. They had all returned to LAX for today's ceremony, the official dedication of the Terminal 4 Memorial Wall. The wall, stretching along the corridor leading to the security checkpoint, listed the names of every American service member who had died on Hamburger Hill. But it didn't stop there. The design incorporated space for adding names and stories from other conflicts, creating a living monument to service and sacrifice. "They're ready for us," Cooper said softly. "The secretary's here, and John Chen brought a group from the Vietnamese American community." As they moved toward the ceremony location, Harrison noticed something that would have been unimaginable a month ago. Passengers were voluntarily stepping out of the security line to join the gathering crowd. TSA agents, during their breaks, were positioning themselves to watch. Airport staff paused in their duties, understanding that they were about to witness something important. Secretary Wilson began the ceremony with words that captured the transformation of the past month. 30 days ago, we implemented the Harrison Protocol across our nation's transportation network. Today, we dedicate this wall not just to the memories it preserves, but to the understanding it creates. John Chen stepped forward to read names from the wall, beginning with his brother Tommy. Each name echoed through the terminal carried by the same PA system that normally announced departures and arrivals. After each name, a bell tolled softly. Harrison watched the faces in the crowd as the names were read. Young children tugging their parents' sleeves, asking questions about the wall. Elderly veterans standing straighter, medals and decorations now proudly visible. TSA agents listening intently, understanding that each name represented a story they were now trained to honor. Miller leaned close to Harrison. "Sir, remember what you told me that first morning? About how the medal wasn't meant to be a pass or a privilege, but a responsibility?" Harrison nodded. "I understand that now," Miller continued. "Every time we recognize a veteran, every time we honor their service, we're not just following a protocol. We're carrying their stories forward. We're keeping the promises you made on that mountain." The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a new addition to the wall, a bronze plaque bearing Lieutenant Wells' final words. "What we do tomorrow isn't just about taking a hill, it's about who we become in the process." As the crowd began, to disperse, Harrison remained, studying the names he had carried in his heart for 50 years. Rodriguez stood beside him, both men lost in memories of rain and mud and courage. "Think they know Ghost?" Rodriguez asked quietly. "Think they know what their sacrifice created?" Harrison watched as a young TSA agent stopped to help an elderly veteran remove his shoes, handling the task with gentle respect while asking about the campaign ribbons on his jacket. Nearby, a child pressed her hand against Tommy Chen's name on the wall while her father explained what words like courage and sacrifice really meant. "Yes," Harrison replied, touching the Medal of Honor at his throat one last time. "They know, and now, thanks to what started here, everyone else will know too." The morning sun streamed through Terminal 4's windows, catching the medal of medals, and decorations worn proudly by veterans passing through security. Each gleam of light, each moment of recognition, each story shared added another thread to the tapestry of understanding that had begun with one medal falling from one bag on, one ordinary morning that had become extraordinary. The ghost of Hamburger Hill could rest now. The promises had been kept. The stories would be told. And in airports across America, every day, the simple act of seeing, recognizing, and honoring would ensure that no veteran sacrifice would ever go unrecognized again. Type honor if you believe every hero deserves to be remembered. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that touch the heart and preserve the memories of those who served.